You usually say the companies on paper, but today it's not on paper. It may be a copy on paper, but it's on a screen, right? It's on a monitor.
Yeah.
So probably that also increased that this factor in the globalization, the infrastructural communication increased this phenomenon in a way, as the financial industry exploited this fact that you can transfer wealth and trade whatever you want, commodity or slice commodity in little piece, and create other instrument and so on through basically software and communication infrastructure. Do you think that this also is part of the problem in a way, and helped to make this phenomenon even bigger?
Yeah, yeah. I think that globalization has turbocharged the way in which tax havens are used. There's no question about it. They've grown enormously. We've seen more tax havens emerge in the global economy. There are new players entering pretty much year by year. So far from diminishing, I think, if anything, the problem is growing, and we're seeing some centres like Singapore, for example, grow very, very rapidly. Mauritius is growing very rapidly, and technological change has played a huge part in it. I mean, the truth of the matter is, you don't need to go to Mauritius to use Mauritius. You can, set up accounts and structures there, and everything happens on the internet. All the transactions happen on the internet. There's no need for you to be physically there. There's no need even for there to be a paper trail, because all of these things are now conducted in a digital world. So I think that globalization has gone hand in hand with the technological revolution, which has made it much, much easier for a far wider range of companies and people to make effective use of tax havens. Offshore lies at the heart of the modern economy. Tax havens have become integrated into what's now called globalization to such an extent that the vast majority of international trade and international investment is routed through tax havens on paper. And this is for two purposes. First of all, it's to evade or avoid tax, and secondly, it's to evade or avoid regulation. The extraordinary thing is how little attention has been paid to this by the political communities, and probably because these tax havens are protected and supported by the most powerful countries in the world. As you've seen a concentration of capitalism into a smaller number of players, we now have 500 or so transnational companies that dominate the global economy. Almost all of them use tax havens extensively. It's in the interests of the bankers and the accountants and the company directors who use these places extensively to ensure that no effective measures are ever taken to tackle the problem of tax havens. The banks are very, very prominent players here, particularly British and American banks. Then you have certain jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands. When you look at them on paper, you realise the British Virgin Islands is one of the biggest investors, if not the biggest investor, in mainland China. One has to ask the question, how did that happen? What's going on here? And that's because Chinese elites, Chinese politicians, Chinese business people are using the British Virgin Islands to shift capital out of China and then reinvest it back into China. Apparently it's foreign direct investment. And if you look at the case of India, you'll see that India has a similar structure where the vast majority of foreign direct investment going into India comes from Mauritius, another tax haven in the Indian Ocean. What's going on there? Again, the Indian elites by and large have shifted their capital offshore and reinvested it back into India. Apparently it's foreign direct investment. Why do they do this? Because they can get all the tax breaks that go with foreign direct investment. In my own research, looking, for example, at Barclays' activities in Africa, you'll see that Barclays have been very influential in trying to push African politicians to create offshore financial centres in Ghana, for example, in Botswana, in Kenya. From my own research, it appears that the vast majority of commodity trading, particularly metal trading, now happens through tax havens, again, because it's so easy to shift the profits from metal trading out of the countries which produce the gold and the copper and the coltan and so on into tax havens where it accumulates in the hands of a very tiny minority. The huge damage done by tax havens actually impacts worst on the poorer countries in the south. And that's because a huge proportion of their mineral wealth, gold, copper and other hydrocarbon wealth, has simply been shifted out of these countries through tax havens and into the capital markets, the major capital markets of the north. And tax havens have been right at the centre of this massive shift of wealth. In the case of Africa, it's estimated to be heading for 900 billion over the last 25 years. It's a massive sum, and it's vastly greater than the total aid flowing in the other direction. So tax havens have literally crushed the opportunities for development in the south. It's also criminalised a large part of the economic development of the south because it's enabled the despots and the dictators to shift their wealth offshore into Switzerland, into Luxembourg, into United Kingdom, into London, with relative impunity. And virtually everyone in these countries knows this is happening. They're well aware of how tax havens fit into this process. They don't understand why the West allows this to happen. But they know that their countries are being robbed of their assets, and it causes great resentment. And the end result is we have a security hazard on our hand because the West is regarded as being complicit in the looting of the country's assets. I'm strongly in favour of internationalism rather than nationalism.
Right.
And setting up international rules which favour the entire world must be our long-term goal without undermining national democracies. At the moment, the current era of globalisation has achieved the exact opposite. It's enabled capital to flow without any problems at all, but puts up barriers to migratory flows of labour. So you have all that capital flowing out of poorer countries, but the poor people are told, no, you can't leave, you must stay there. Even if your capital is gone and your long-term development prospects are going across over the horizon as your capital disappears, you can't join it. And that's where things have gone so badly wrong for so many of the poorer countries.
And taking advantage of specific jurisdiction where the law help like the wealthy. It's like a globalized world based on really small local jurisdiction.
Absolutely,
really
yes.
amazing.
I mean, these are. It's almost like we've created a framework to meet the interests of a plutocratic elite. The Occupy movement talks in terms of the 1%, and I think that is actually broadly accurate. It is a very, very small part of the global elite who can take advantage of this current form of globalization because they can use tax havens, they can remove themselves from regulation, they can remove themselves from taxes, but they can still take advantage of all the facilities that ordinary people pay for through their taxes. One of the reasons why we talk about tax havens as secrecy jurisdictions is because when you look at how they operate, what they're really providing to their clients is secrecy, a lack of transparency. And certainly I see transparency as a very, very major part of the solution to the problem of tax havens. If we could make them more transparent by, for example, requiring them to disclose who owns these mysterious offshore companies, who are the real people behind them, who are the people who benefit from these mysterious offshore trusts and offshore foundations, then they would be less open to being used for criminal activities. In many cases, they're closed down because the only real usages of these places lies with criminal activity. So certainly transparency, that is operational transparency of disclosing who owns the companies, transparency of the accounting systems of multinational companies, so they're required to report on the activities of all their subsidiaries in every tax haven where they operate. And also transparency in the form of better international cooperation on sharing information. So a citizen here in Europe can't simply set up an account in Mauritius and refuse to disclose what interest earnings they're getting on that bank account in Mauritius because the Mauritius government has to, under international treaty arrangements, automatically share that information, that would overcome most of the abuses of tax havens, and the problem would be significantly diminished. If the lack of transparency could be solved, many of the most egregious uses of tax havens would be solved.
A couple of weeks ago, in the media, there was this issue about Amazon in Luxembourg. Did you see that made the headline? And 3 days ago, Osborne, the family of Osborne, like Cameron,
Yes.
was in the headline.
Yeah, yes.
I mean, sure, also Osborne, probably, yeah. And,
Osborne is as well. I've made a program about that.
okay, good. And also the Mitt Romney, also in the States, also has offshore bank account. So I wonder, everyone knows about that, right? So it's okay. So it's about transparency because we want to know more about these things. But I mean, to tackle that seems that we need something else. I mean, it seems more like pressuring, like politicians, like banning, like this practice, banning these structures in a way.
Sure.
Can you like comment this thing that everyone knows and it's always in the media, everyone uses it, but I mean, it's not even a secret anymore somehow,
In many respects, I see tackling offshore as being similar to tackling the slave economies, particularly the slave economy of North America, the 17th, 18th century. Everybody was involved. The politicians, let's face it, Jefferson, Washington, all of these key families in North America were using slaves. So they all had a vested interest in keeping the status quo. And that's where we are now. The vast majority of big companies, the vast majority of political parties use offshore or secure their funding from offshore sources. It's really built itself very heavily into the modern political economy. So that no one with any power has any interest in changing the system. And the solution, I think, to break free from this impasse lies with building such a global citizen pressure for change that the politicians can no longer ignore the situation. Throughout my life, since I was a young man in my 20s, I've been talking with politicians about this, and they all agree that there's a problem, but no one seems to want to take the political initiative to seriously tackle the problem. So for all of the global initiatives, whether it's G20 or G7 earlier on, have been remarkably superficial because they want to say we're doing something without actually taking effective action. Effective action will only happen when global civil society demands it. And that's why I welcome, for example, UK Uncut getting onto the streets. I've been involved myself in that. I also welcome the Occupy movement taking to the streets precisely around these issues. They've said tax justice is a core part of their demands. Because this is the only way in which we're going to force our political elites to take effective action. I think it's really important that we bring this open secret to the heart of a global discussion about what kind of economy do we need to meet public needs, to meet, in other words, public interest. What kind of democracy do we want which can overcome the problem of this very anti-democratic misuse of tax havens. And I think that to do this, it's really important that the public understand the scale of operation, the extent to which companies are using tax havens. I think they'd be shocked, in some respects enraged and galvanized into taking action if they understood just how massive this offshore economy has become.
Yeah, it's weird, these double standards of government and politicians by trying to tackle it and then, even like compete as offshore center. Like now it seems really kind of, economic warfare that everyone wants to become offshore center to compete. Yeah. And London is pretty amazing to see how they push this way, and they want to keep it. Also in the recent discussion about regulation, financial regulations, like London say, no, we don't want to regulate it because for us, like the business as it is. And
Do you want me to address that issue?
I don't know if you have a comment on that.
I certainly do. The empire formally collapsed. The British Empire formally collapsed in 1956, the year I was born. That was the year of Suez. That was the end of the former British Empire. Coincidentally, almost at the same time, London started the first steps towards becoming an offshore financial centre, and that occurred through the launch of what's now known as the euro-dollar market or the euro-bond market. That is effectively offshore, a market in offshore deposits, which sits outside the regulatory structures and by and large is untaxed. In many respects, tax havens are a reaction to attempts in the 1940s to overcome the financial crisis and the collapse of the economy in the 1920s and 1930s. Regulations were put into place in 1946. New institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created precisely to arrive at a more regulated global economy. And business, this is capital, reacted to that. The City of London, in particular, wanting to rebuild its preeminent position in the global financial markets by acting as an offshore financial centre and tax haven. And it's not coincidence that the vast majority of the small island tax havens, which people, the general public, think of as tax havens, whether it's the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands or the Channel Islands or Bermuda, vast majority of them have the Queen's head on their stamp. And that's not coincidence, because this was a purposeful, carefully constructed process of the City of London recreating its preeminence by creating all of these satellite centres which would attract money from different parts of the world and feed it through into London. Whether it's done the British economy any good is a moot point. Personally, I don't think it has. What it has done is it's rebuilt London as the preeminent financial centre, but I think this in many respects has had a negative impact on British people. It certainly hasn't created a vast, genuine investment in productive activity. By and large, it's attracted speculative, rent-seeking capital rather than long-term foreign direct investment. But it does seem to me there's been a key part of Britain's development strategy that tax havens would be used to attract huge amounts of capital from across the world into London. Whilst the G20, that is the group of 20 countries, talks about the OECD as being the solution to tackling the tax havens, in my opinion, the OECD is the problem, not the solution. Their remedies are invariably ineffective. And that's not because these are stupid people who don't know what they're doing, it's because they don't really want to tackle the problem at root.
It's true that everything is about who write the rule of the game, you know.
Right.
And you were right, you mentioned that organization. I also read in the book of Nicholas about this other institution that write how the company has to write in their accounting
yes,
book.
The International Accounting Standards Board.
That is, what is that? But they rule.
If ever there was a body that deserves to have much more scrutiny, it is the International Accounting Standards Board. When an ordinary person hears about the International Accounting Standards Board, they think, well, that sounds very important, and therefore it must be some kind of democratically accountable, well-governed, maybe an international institution. No, it's not. It's a private company that sets the rules of accounting for multinational companies. And it's dominated by the big accounting firms and by the big multinational companies. And it operates out of a headquarter here in London, and it doesn't account to anybody at all in any form of democratic process. But they set the rules of the game of capitalism. This is a truly extraordinary story, and you know, I think I dream of the time when one day we'll have an Occupy movement taking over the International Accounting Standards Board and saying, okay, now we're going to start creating International Accounting Standards International Accounting Standards to meet public interest, not to meet the interests of your stakeholders. They realised back in the 1920s, what armies cost money. If you can set up the institutions that create the rules of the game for capitalism, then you don't need the armies. Everything's going to work in the interests of your multinational companies. And that's what they did. They created organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which they totally dominate. And they set the rules of the game, for example, on taxing multinational companies. And no one pays any attention to that because it sounds very technical and very boring, and who the hell wants to get involved in discussions around that? But then when you look at the way capitalism works, you realise the rules have been totally rigged in the interests of the rich countries. And Britain has been there at the forefront time and time again, ensuring not only that the rules are rigged, but that they remain rigged. And any attempt by an organisation like the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, any attempt by them to change the rules is blocked by countries like Britain and the United States. The last thing that British companies want, and Britain wants, is to actually have genuine, free and fair markets. They've never liked to have free markets and fair markets, precisely because they've always liked their markets to be rigged in their favour. It's like having a football game where the rules are rigged in your favour and the referee's on your side, and that's precisely what we have.
How that happened that also like Ireland, that is actually tax haven, or even like London, that is a tax haven, then is broke. So how that is also harmful for the country that become offshore. That is something that I really ask myself sometimes, especially like Ireland, where it's full of American companies, and then it's like really on the brink, totally on the brink.
Sure.
So maybe if you have an answer for that.
It's been fascinating for me watching how having a tax haven on a small island like Jersey, or in London or Ireland, actually doesn't help the local people at all, and for all sorts of reasons. First of all, because tax haven activity is not productive activity. It's actually what economists call rent-seeking activity. In other words, by and large, the people who use tax havens are not interested in investing in productive, job-creating activities. They're trying to chase unearned income, whether it's tax avoiding or speculative trading or whatever. And that, generally speaking, doesn't feed down into jobs for ordinary people. In fact, in many respects, it's negative because all these capital inflows from other countries into London, for example, ends up not as money being invested in new jobs for British people, but money being invested in real estate, in other words, property market speculation, whether it's commercial property or residential property, or in equity markets. In other words, this is not new capital, but capital into the existing markets, into existing companies, which just has an inflationary impact on the economy. The end result is that far from improving and strengthening the economies of the tax havens themselves, it actually weakens their economy in the long run. The resource curse acts in several ways. At an economic level, first of all, exporting all those oil money, all that oil, means you have a wall of money flooding into the economy, and that immediately impacts upon exchange rates. Normal exchange rate, we've shipped upwards, which means that your traditional exporting industries can no longer compete on the global market. You turn from being an exporter to being an importer in all sorts of areas where you used to have an export activity. At the same time, you then find that you have a politically dominant sector. In the case of oil is a very powerful politically dominant sector in a country like Nigeria. So the politicians tend to focus on the interests of the oil industry rather than on the wider thing, particularly since they get their income not by taxing ordinary people, but by taxing the oil companies and getting the royalties from oil. So they're not interested in listening to the ordinary people, they're listening to the oil companies. Democracy gets undermined because the politicians are paying more attention to how they raise money from the oil industry than from how they tax and respond to the needs of ordinary citizens. So the resource curse impacts on the political economy and upon democracy itself. It undermines it. We see similar things. We think we see similar things with the finance curse. Hosting a large finance industry means that politicians seem to pay much more attention to the interests of the bankers and the law firms and the accountancy firms that run the finance industry than they pay attention to the interests of the general population. And it's worse because finance is so mobile. Oil just tends to, it's in the ground, it can't move that easily. What we find in the finance world is they're able to exert much stronger political pressure by saying, if you try to tax us, or you try to regulate us, we'll leave London. We'll get out of here, we'll go to Luxembourg, or we'll go to Zurich, or we'll go to Dublin. And that threat normally means that politicians are extremely unwilling to tackle them. The more dependent a country or a small tax haven island is on hosting it on the finance industry, the greater the long-term risk to that place, because dependency leads to vicious circles. The other sectors are crowded out by the high cost of living, the high cost of housing, the high labour market costs which go with having a large finance industry. And so you have an increasing level of dependence and therefore an increasing level of political interference and demands being placed upon your democratic system.
The local population of Cayman Island or like Jersey, they may stress this regulation of their own jurisdiction, because then I don't know about Jersey, but I read about Cayman, about the election, how they work there, and that there is not really popular representation in the parliament. I don't know about Jersey. Do they have like a proper parliament there? No.
Well, they have what's called the States of Jersey. In fact, I used to be the economic advisor to the States of Jersey. So I was for 11 years, and
right.
It was extraordinary. But it's not a democratic government in the normal sense of the term. First of all, they don't have political parties. They don't have a government and opposition. They don't have it's what's called a unicameral system, just one assembly, not two assemblies. So you don't have one assembly laws. They don't have a free press in the conventional sense of that term. They don't have universities and think tanks and other civil society organisations scrutinising what's going on. So in many respects, this is not a particularly democratic system. If you ever go to the Cayman Islands as a journalist, don't ever start asking questions, any questions at all, because the law provides for anyone who asks any questions which might lead to the revealing of secrets is themselves guilty of a crime.
Even asking?
Even asking the question.
Wow, I didn't know about asking.
I come from a small island. I grew up in a small island. The culture there it closes in upon you. There's a lot of pressure to conform. Don't speak out. Don't say the emperor has no clothes. People who do speak out, generally speaking, are attacked, criticised. The term over there in Jersey is don't rock the boat.
Right.
Don't do anything which might attract international attention to what we're doing here. And I have a very different definition of corruption to the World Bank definition. The World Bank tends to see corruption as an activity where a public sector employee asks for a bribe to make something happen. I think corruption involves any kind of activity which undermines public confidence in the integrity of our institutions, our laws, our systems that make society work. So if journalists don't ask the right questions deliberately, that in a way is corrupting.
Right.
It's feeding corruption. So I think we need to expand the way in which we look at corruption to understand how, if politicians don't scrutinise legislation, it's their job to do that. But if they don't do that, because they don't want to actually explore what the implications of these laws might be, that in its own way is corruption. Tax evasion is corruption because it's theft of public property.
Yeah.
But it's also undermining the public's confidence in the tax system. We all pay taxes on the understanding that you pay the same tax on the same basis as me. But if we think that special deals are being done, for example, Vodafone is able to take the senior tax inspector for dinner, and over dinner talk about doing a special deal, which saves them billions of pounds, then I think the public reasonably begin to think, well, if they can do it, why can't we? This is corrupt. When we started our project, in my case, I started this project a hell of a long time ago, but when we formalised our network, in Florence, by the way, our network was launched in Florence in 2002, we thought it would take at least 15 years to raise public awareness to that level where you could have this kind of informed public debate. In some respects, the financial crisis has helped us enormously because the UK Uncut and the Occupy movements have massively amplified the discussion. And then you've had a lot of, the Guardian newspaper, for example, adopted us quite early on, and they've been very helpful in the Amazon case study and revealing Cameron's family things and so on. The debate has gone further than we expected and faster than we expected when we started. I think we've still got a heck of a long way to go. I think here in Europe we're probably well ahead of the curve. In the USA, things have caught up remarkably in the last couple of years. 2 years ago, the Tea Party movement, anti-tax, anti-state, were kind of dominating the discussion. Now we have a coalition called the FACT Coalition, which brings together a whole range of different civil society groupings, small businesses, organised labour, human rights activists, economic justice activists, and they're actually providing a counter-narrative very effectively. And happily, and you mentioned Mitt Romney earlier on, Paolo, I mean, he's, in some respects, turbocharged the issues because he is one of the prime users. His business model was largely built around the Cayman Islands.